Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On the program today, we have what I think might be the most epic listener tale to date. In fact, we have two stories that could be dreams, or they could be something else. The first is a faceless girl who is sent to deliver a message to a woman in Texas. The second comes from Alex in Manchester, England. His story takes place aboard a Scottish train in 1879. But here's the rub. He boarded it in 2005. Freaky stuff. We introduce an audiobook called Rivals that has become a favorite of mine, and we start it all off with this riddle from 8-year-old Annie.
And now, a new 2.5-minute mystery.
This 2.5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Ann Hansen from Little Rock, Arkansas. She sends in this simple riddle that I got wrong on my first reading. Now, here is our story. Andy is put in a cell with a dirt floor and only one window. The window is too high for him to reach. The only thing in the cell is a shovel. He won't be able to get any food or water and has only 2 days to escape or he'll die. And he can't dig a tunnel because the walls go too deep and the ground is too soft. How will Andy escape from the cell?
In just a minute, we'll have our solution. But first, a message from our sponsor.
Do you enjoy these 2.5-minute mysteries? Please let me know. Also, if you have one to share, I'd love to hear it. Go to ronsamazingstories.com and click on the Contact tab. And now, here is our solution. Did you figure it out? The answer is actually simple. All Andy has to do is use the shovel to create a pile of dirt under the window so he can climb up to it and escape from the cell. Simple logic. This 2.5-minute mystery was brought to you by Ann Hansen from Little Rock, Arkansas. She is 8 years old and is the third person to send in a detective riddle to the show. Thank you, Ann.
What's that you say?
Well, things continued to progress and I'm feeling a little bit better every day. I'm still receiving get well notes and tweets and emails from folks, and I want to thank everyone that has written in. I have not restarted everything yet, but that mostly includes the editing side of my life, and I hope to get back to that sooner than later. I did receive this from Jack Browning, who wrote, "Hey Ron, you are the best and I hope that you're feeling better. As a longtime New Yorker, I want to thank you for your kind words. It has been a very strange time here in Queens, but like that person said from Hell's Kitchen, somehow it's brought us all together. I love the podcast, keep it coming, and I listen every week. Thank you, Jack." Well, Jack, I'll say it again. I have been very impressed by the people of New York and applaud your handling of COVID-19. In fact, for the most part, I'm proud of America. I believe that we are getting close to the end of this, and me, personally, I can't wait. So, thank you to everyone, and please stay safe and healthy. Now we have what just might be my favorite message from Audible. of all time. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? Rivals, Frenemies Who Changed the World by Scott McCormick. This title is an Audible exclusive, and without a minute of hesitation, I dub it a hilarious narrative of history fit for all ages. Did you know that most of our dinosaur fossils were discovered because two grown men absolutely hated each other? It's true, and this book tells that story and many others. Here's a clip.
When we think of rivalries and feuds, we often think of warring families or groups of people caught up in a pointless, destructive, and bitter hostility.
You stole my pig!
The feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which, yes, was partially about a pig, lasted for 13 years and led to the death of over a dozen people. History is littered with such family feuds. There are also many famous rivalries between individuals. Actresses Bette Davis and Joan Crawford had a rivalry that lasted decades.
You stole my man.
And while these rivalries are all fascinating, they haven't left much of a lasting mark on the world. There are some rivalries, however, pointless, petty, embarrassing, disgraceful, and even bloody rivalries that have helped to shape history.
You stole my bones!
These are the rivalries that changed the world. Okay, let's do this. Round 1. Cope versus Marsh. This nasty rivalry between two eminent scientists has got it all. Name-calling, rock-throwing, explosions, political scandals, dinosaurs, and the bountiful pits of New Jersey.
Jersey!
It's a feud that lasted for nearly 30 years, embarrassed the entire scientific community, and led to numerous mistakes that continue to baffle paleontologists to this day. Kids, have you ever seen a baffled paleontologist? It's not a pretty sight. We don't recommend it. The thing of it is, this whole bewildering brouhaha boiled down to one simple fact. Professor O.C. Marsh wanted all the bones. When we say that Othniel Charles Marsh wanted all the bones, we mean just that. He literally wanted every single bone buried in the entire country to be his and his alone. That greedy desire is what started the feud between Marsh and his rival, Edward Drinker Cope. It's what destroyed their careers, and it turned paleontology into a full-contact sport. But their rivalry also sparked the greatest era of dinosaur discovery, helped cement a bold theory about the development of life on Earth, and propelled America to the forefront of the scientific age. So, there's that. It all began the way so many feuds do, as a friendship. The two scientists met in Berlin, Germany in 1864. Marsh had recently been hired by Yale as America's first professor of paleontology. The self-taught Cope, though not a professor, had already made a name for himself by publishing 37 scientific papers. He was only 23 years old. Though 9 years older, Marsh had only published 2 papers. So Marsh was impressed with the young man. The two roamed around Europe, taking in the sights, talking about dinosaurs, and just generally avoiding being drafted into the American Civil War.
I say, drinking beer in Berlin sure beats dying in a ditch in Virginia. Cheers!
The two men formed a fast friendship. They corresponded with each other upon returning to the U.S., and even went so far as to name new species after each other. How did everything go so wrong? They went to New Jersey.
Jersey!
But first, a little background. Today, we take dinosaurs for granted. We play with dinosaur toys, read books about dinosaurs, and we watch people get devoured by dinosaurs in movies. Every child today knows the basic story behind these creatures who lived millions of years ago. But in the early 1800s, people didn't know what to make of those enormous bones that were being unearthed around the world. Back then, people were having a hard time with the idea that the world could possibly be more than 6,000 years old. After all, famous scientists like Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton thought the world had been created around 4000 BC. Famed theologian Archbishop James Ussher used the Bible to calculate that the world had been created on, and this is real, Saturday, October 23rd, 4004 BC, at 9 a.m., just in time for brunch. However, books being written in the 1800s, like Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species and Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, suggested the Earth might be, get this, hundreds of millions of years old. And while at first that seemed like an outlandish concept, the fact that people were finding the remains of enormous creatures like Megalosaurus seemed to back that up. Okay, let's go to New Jersey.
Jersey!
In 1858, America's first complete dinosaur was discovered in a pit in Haddonfield. The man who discovered the bones contacted a University of Pennsylvania professor named Joseph Leidy.
After careful analysis, using the most advanced scientific methodology, I've determined that these large lizard-like bones must have belonged to some kind of large lizard creature. So, I'm gonna name it Large Lizard.
Excuse me, Professor Leidy. That don't sound very scientific.
You're right. How about Hadrosaurus?
Well, that sure sounds fancy. What does Hadrosaurus mean?
It's Greek for large lizard.
Wow! The marvels of science.
Rivals, Frenemies Who Changed the World is a wonderfully silly book. Think of it as if Monty Python was teaching a history class. Each volume of 4 30-minute histories will dig into the petty name-calling and grumbling grudges that led to many of the world's greatest achievements, all delivered with a cheeky sense of humor. In this book, you get to choose sides. Cope or Marsh, the jerks who discovered so many dinosaurs. Hamilton or Burr, whose conflict fueled American politics. Queen Elizabeth, or the Mary Queen of Scots, who fought to rule England. Or maybe Adidas or Puma, who changed the world of sports and fashion forever. Kidnappings, rock fights, duels, and explosions. Rivals shows our world leaders at their absolute best and their worst, sometimes at the same time. Now, you can have this book today. Here is what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can get your copy of Rivals, Frenemies Who Changed the World today. Thank you, Audible. And now, it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story comes from Tisa Barlow, who lives in El Paso, Texas. Her story is nothing short of amazing, and Tisa has called it A Night Visit from Adriana. Hello, Ron. My husband, who is also named Ron, had just started listening to your podcast a few weeks ago. He thought that I might enjoy it, and well, now we listen together. Thank you for your show, and I hope you enjoy my ghost story, although it might better fit under the head scratcher column. I've always had trouble with sleeping. Even with prescriptions to help me, I couldn't stay asleep for very long. I do seem to get some rest between 2 and 3 a.m., but that's when I dream. In one dream, something whispered in my ear, "Wake up, someone's here." I remember it felt like a bolt of lightning strike my spine that made me sit straight up and look at the door. A little girl was standing next to my husband, who was still sleeping. She had a strange hue and looked like a ghost if ever you saw one. Smoky gray, transparent, but yet somehow solid. She began to float towards the foot of the bed. She turned the corner and stopped near where my foot was. I could barely see her face, but the details of her hair and the collar of her dress were quite clear. I have poor night vision, but I could see her easily in the dark. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She grabbed my left ankle hard, forcing me to kick out with my right foot. The blankets prevented that, and I woke up, thrashing about. It had all been a dream, and I know I had never seen this girl before. When I got up the next day, I made a sketch of the girl so that I would remember her. I had lunch with a friend of mine who's an empath. I showed him the sketch I had made of the faceless child. Sam was quiet for a really long time. Minutes later, he spoke. "Try not to freak out." He reached for his phone. He had family pictures stored on it that he was curating. After a minute of thumbing through them, he showed me a picture of his deceased wife when she was 8 years old. It was the same haircut, same dress, same chubby cheeks. He continued to look through his photo and showed me another that was very similar to my sketch. I burst into tears, confused, and I was freaking out, all at the same time. I met Sam 5 years ago. He was already a widower when I had met him, so I had never met her. I don't know why I cried, but I do know I was furious, asking myself, why me? I don't know what she wants. I'm not flirting with her husband because I'm happily married for 10 years now. Sam tried to comfort me. "I don't know why she's making contact with you," he said. "She's a good woman. Trust me. I think she's trying to warn you about something, but I have no idea why." He sent me copies of the photos, and I went home. I sat down with my husband after dinner and told him the whole story. At first, he said it was all a dream, until I showed him the evidence. Then he wasn't so sure. We talked about it for some time and then went to bed. Again, right at 2 a.m., I awoke. Same feeling as before, but this time I was ready. There she was, standing in the same place, again looking at my husband. This time her face was clear, and I could see it was that little girl in the pictures. I didn't freak out, and I asked her, "What is it that you want to tell me?" She smiled and simply said that I needed to go to the doctor and that they know what was wrong with me. I made an appointment the next day, and my husband went with me. After many tests, scans, sleep sessions, too many to count, they found a tumor in my brain. It was about the size of an acorn. I had surgery to have it removed, and my sleeping problems vanished forever. One more thing, the doctor said, that if it had been left untreated, I probably would have died within a few weeks. I don't know why it was my friend's wife that got this message to me, but I am forever grateful for it. Both my husband and I are now expecting a baby, and you'd be guessing right if you think it might be a little girl. We plan to name her Adriana, after Sam's wife. Tisa Barlow, El Paso, Texas. Well, Tisa, this is something special to be sure. I have to wonder why she wanted to send that message to you, but I think it's pretty clear that your baby Adriana has something to do with it. I hope you write us back and tell us about the birth of your baby and the events that could quite possibly follow after. Thank you, Tisa, for sharing your story. Our next story isn't a story. Or is it? I think even the author doesn't know for sure. Our dreams can feel so real sometimes that it's hard to tell the difference. This story could also be a very real time slip. If that's the case, then it becomes terrifying. I'll leave it up to you to decide. The tale was called The Toil Bridge Train, and it was sent in by Alexander Short. Alexander sent this note. Hey Ron, thank you for your podcast. The story I have for you was transcribed from my personal journal. I finally found it after all this time. I know the writing needs some work, and you have my permission to edit it. I swear too much. I don't know what category to put this in. I'll leave that to you. Thank you ahead of time for reading this on the show. I now live in Manchester, England. I know you like to have the place of origin. Alex. Well, Alex, here is your journal entry from December 28th, 2005. I'm writing this because tonight something terrible happened to me. I didn't know it at the time, but my fate as a human being became mired in the dark clutches of death. And it's all because of some stupid train. My name is Alex, and I'm writing this now in this journal that my mother had given me just before I started this trip. You see, I'm a performer, an actor, so to speak. I had been doing a show in Edinburgh, the Fringe Festival, pretty much actor heaven. Any show that you want to see, it'll probably be there. It has been going since 1947, and it's amazing. I was in a 3-person show, a small rendition of Stephen King's Misery. I played the writer, Paul Sheldon, and we performed in this dingy, dirty warehouse. It was perfect. It was small. It was intimate. I couldn't have asked for a better opportunity. Sorry, I know I'm ignoring the train, but frankly, I don't even know where to start. I wanted to stay in Scotland for a couple months after we closed the show. I had fallen in love with the Gothic architecture, the deep history. That kind of stuff calls to me. But the weather and everything else about this place was rather gloomy, but I still loved it. Well, I boarded the train at Burnt Island and was heading to Dundee to see Glamis Castle and the statue of Desperate Dan. I love old castles, okay? I got on the train around dusk. There were 70 other people, give or take. I had been on a Stephen King kick, kind of ironic now when you think about it, and sat down to dig into his book, The Shining. Never read it before. It was about some psychic kid with daddy issues. Or at least that's what my classmates said before throwing me her copy. I was well into the novel when around 6 p.m. I started feeling my eyes getting kind of droopy, and I was feeling tired. This is where things went wrong. This is the one time I wish I could have stayed awake. I didn't know it then, but I'd messed up. I woke up about an hour later, 7 p.m., feeling like crap. Something smelled. That smell you get when you find a dead rat under your bed, left by your cat. I look around me and everything feels different. It feels wrong. That feeling you get when your mother and father calls you and says, "Hey, I have some bad news." That feeling in your stomach, like a punch from Ali. Everything looks old, like right out of the turn of the century strange. It felt like I was being goofed on or something. Maybe they had gassed me and put me on a strange train for a laugh. At least that's what I wanted to think. But no one knows I'm here, and I'm traveling alone. Oh, and that smell was making me gag. Looking around the train, I also noticed that I was alone. The lights were really dim. That's when I noticed candlelight. I asked myself, what is going on? The train engine was loud. I can't even believe that I slept through it, but it was loud. I looked outside for any sign of civilization, lights, people, anything. I was starting to panic. Then, out of the door to the coach in front of my compartment, I could see someone walk through the door. My anxiety subsided for a moment, and I breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He was looking at the ground, and when his gaze finally met mine, the anxiety returned. In fact, it was skyrocketing. Everything inside me was telling me, time to get off this train. So I got up and asked the man who was standing in the aisle about 6 feet from me. I caught his eyes again, although he seemed to be avoiding my sight. It was dark. I really couldn't make out his face. I screamed at him because of the engine noise. "Hey, what's the big deal? Where are we? Why was I moved to this old, smelly train? Where is everyone else?" He looked at me, releases a heavy sigh, and simply points to the seats behind me. 2 seconds ago, I was alone on this train, and now I look behind me and there were people. Or at least I think they were people. They all had the same expression, maybe looking at different things, but they all had the same expression. Their eyes kept darting towards the windows of the car, back at me, and then to the windows. They were looking for something. I don't know what, but they all looked antsy and uneasy. I look back at the man whose face finally appears in the candlelight, and he introduces himself as Mr. Broach, son of Sir Thomas Broach. I said back to him, "Look, I don't give a rat's buttock who your father is, and I swear if this is some kind of joke, the first 2 I'm coming after are you and your father." I was mad, enraged. I usually don't say such awful things, but I was really beginning to panic. He simply told me, "Everything is fine, and please return to my seat." I obliged him, taking a second to regain my cool. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just having a crazy nightmare. So I sat, and I began to look around to the other passengers for help. They wouldn't talk to me. None of them would talk to me. They would just look at me with a worried expression. There was a storm surging outside. Thunder rings every few seconds. Well, after not getting any help from the other passengers, I went back to my seat. The storm was right over us. I'd never been so close to lightning bolts. You see, I could see them crack and split trees along the side of the train from the window. Then I noticed the clothing of the passengers. It looked like I had been dropped into the late 1800s. Most of the men were wearing kilts, and the women were wearing those weird hoop dresses, and everyone carried that terrible smell of death. Okay, now, this is the point where I started looking around for cameras and sound equipment. If this was a goof, and it had to be, it was a good one. I didn't find anything. There was no way I just fell asleep and then fell 100 years through the past. Then the car started to rock back and forth on the rails. You could hear the screeching of the steel wheels. Sparks flew up past the windows, and everyone began to scream. I watched their eyes as they rolled back in their heads. Their faces began to disappear into the darkness. Bolts of lightning, the only thing to illuminate their tortured faces. I ran to a window to try to see what was up ahead. There was a large bridge about a mile away. As we got closer, people started moving towards the doors and windows. As soon as we were over water, they started jumping out of the windows and the doors, disappearing into the darkness. Some stayed, crying in the arms of their loved ones. I ducked back into my seat, and all I could do was laugh. I know that sounds weird, but when that much terror is introduced, that's the only reaction that felt appropriate to me. Quickly, though, the laughs turned to tears. My life flashed before my eyes. It didn't take long. I wasn't done. I didn't want to go. I've never been so scared in all my life. I put my hands together and I said aloud, "God, if you're out there, man, I could really use your help. I know you don't owe me a thing, but I'm not done here. I still have more to do. I still haven't had kids or a wife or said goodbye to my loved ones. Please, don't let me die like this." The train really began to jolt back and forth, throwing people and luggage about violently. Then a loud thump came from below the train. Everyone left in the car was screaming. I can still hear it, even now. The train felt like it leapt into the air and then fell. I remember the splash as it hit the water, the chill as the car started to fill with water. This was it. This was how I would die. I take one look around and there's absolute chaos. People are grabbing at luggage, trying to force windows open. It was all too late. We were now neck deep in water and the train had hit the bottom. I take one last big breath with tears in my eyes. I didn't want to go. I love life. This wasn't fair. I know people tell you all the time that life isn't fair. Well, they never sank to the bottom of the river in a train car. So many things I wanted to do, and I'll never get to do them. A life wasted. That's why I cried. The water extinguished the candles. The screams formed into gurgled cries and whimpers. Then, no sound. Silence. Dark and heavy silence. The only things I could make out were the bodies beginning to float around me. The cracks of lightning were still strobing the waters around me. I couldn't hold my breath anymore, so I let go. I let the water into my lungs, and I fell into darkness. After this, I thought, there better be a cold beer and a nice redhead for me on the other side. And just like that, I snapped up in my seat. I looked around and I was back on the regular train. I started jumping up and down, laughing hysterically. The other passengers in the car looked on in horror. I thought, I'm alive. I made it. People asked me what happened, but I didn't have the courage to tell them, in fear that I would look like a Looney Tune. But really, I just didn't want to jinx it. When I got off the train in Dundee, I felt safe, and I noticed a small little plaque on the landing. It read, Historical Marker Number 317. I paraphrase. Did you know that on Sunday, December 28, 1879, this bridge collapsed, sinking a train to the bottom of the river? Witnesses say that it had been the worst storm in 30 years. It happened at 7:13 p.m., and there were no survivors. Only 46 of the bodies were recovered. I still don't know to this day whether it was real or not. Frankly, I just get scared thinking about it. I've had some issues sleeping because when I start to get tired, I freak out just a little bit, thinking of me sinking to the bottom. I won't ever ride a train again. It's been a long time since my nightmare aboard the ghost train, but I can still feel the water in my lungs. Maybe someday that will go away. Alexander Short, Manchester, England. That has to be one of the best stories we've ever had, true or dream. I really don't know how to comment on this one other than I had to stop several times while reading to shake off the shivers. Truly amazing, Alex, and I thank you for sharing it with us. Our featured story is something pretty special, but you're going to have to listen to it with a 1930s point of view. What we'll hear is a story that comes from the second issue of the classic science fiction magazine, Astounding Stories. The tale is called Into Space, and it first appeared in issue 2, which was published in February of 1930. I love this story, even though it's kinda eggheadish. And yes, I know that's not a word, but it fits. And the science? Well, it makes sense, but it's mostly nonsense. Please enjoy Into Space, read for us by Stephen Bateman.
Into Space by Sterner St. Paul. Many of my readers will remember the mysterious radio messages which were heard by both amateur and professional shortwave operators during the nights of the 23rd and 24th of last September, and even more will remember the astounding discovery made by Professor Montesquieu of the Lick Observatory on the night of September 25th. At the time, some inspired writers tried to connect the two events, maintaining that the discovery of the fact that the Earth had a new satellite coincident with the receipt of the mysterious messages was evidence that the new planetoid was inhabited, and that the messages were attempts on the part of the inhabitants to communicate with us. The fact that the messages were on a lower wavelength than any receiver then in existence could receive with any degree of clarity, and the additional fact that they appeared to come from an immense distance, lent a certain air of plausibility to these ebullitions in the Sunday magazine sections. For some weeks the feature writers harped on the subject, but the hurried construction of new receivers which would work on a lower wavelength yielded no results, and the solemn pronouncements of astronomers to the effect that the new celestial body could by no possibility have an atmosphere, on account of its small size, finally put an end to the talk. So the matter lapsed into oblivion. While quite a few people will remember the two events I have noted, I doubt whether there are 500 people alive who will remember anything at all about the disappearance of Dr. Livermore of the University of Calvada on September 23rd. He was a man of some local prominence, but he had no more than a local fame, and few papers outside of California even noted the event in their columns. I do not think that anyone ever tried to connect up his disappearance with the radio messages or the discovery of the new earthly satellite. Yet the three events were closely bound up together, and but for the doctor's disappearance, the other two would have never happened. Dr. Livermore taught physics at Calvada, or at least he taught the subject when he remembered that he had a class and felt like teaching. His students never knew whether he would appear at class or not, but he always passed everyone who took his courses, and so, of course, they were always crowded. The university authorities used to remonstrate with him, but his ability as a research worker was so well known and recognized that he was allowed to go about as he pleased. He was a bachelor who lived alone and who had no interests in life, so far as anyone knew, other than his work. I first made contact with him when I was a freshman at Calvada, and for some unknown reason he took a liking to me. My father had insisted that I follow in his footsteps as an electrical engineer. As he was paying my bills, I had to make a show at studying engineering while I clandestinely pursued my hobby, literature. Dr. Livermore's courses were the easiest in the school, and they counted as science, so I regularly registered for them, cut them, and attended a class in literature as an auditor. The doctor used to meet me on the campus and laughingly scold me for my absence, but he was really in sympathy with my ambition, and he regularly gave me a passing mark and my units of credit without regard to my attendance, or rather, lack of it. When I graduated from Calvada, I was theoretically an electrical engineer. Practically, I had a pretty good knowledge of contemporary literature, and knew almost nothing about my so-called profession. I stalled around Dad's office for a few months until I landed a job as a cub reporter on the San Francisco Graphic, and then I quit him cold. When the storm blew over, Dad admitted that you couldn't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and agreed with a grunt to my new line of work. He said that I would probably be a better reporter than an engineer, because I couldn't by any possibility be a worse one, and let it go at that. However, all this has nothing to do with the story. It just explains how I came to be acquainted with Dr. Livermore in the first place, and why he sent for me on September 22nd in the second place. The morning of the 22nd, the city editor called me in and asked me if I knew old liver pills. "He says that he has a good story ready to break, but he won't talk to anyone but you," went on Barnes. "I offered to send out a good man, for when old liver pills starts a story it ought to be good, but all I got was a high-powered bawling out. He said that he would talk to you or no one, and would just as soon talk to no one as to me any longer, and he hung up. You'd better take a run out to Calvada and see what he has to say. I can have a good man rewrite your drivel when you get back." I was more or less used to that sort of talk from Barnes, so I paid no attention to it. I drove my flivver down to Calvada and asked for the doctor. "Dr. Livermore," said the bursar. "Why, he hasn't been around here for the last 10 months. This is his sabbatical year, and he's spending it on a ranch he owns up at Hat Creek near Mount Lassen. You'll have to go there if you want to see him." I knew better than to report back to Barnes without the story, so there was nothing to it but to drive up to Hat Creek. And a long, hard drive it was. I made Redding late that night. The next day I drove on to Bernie and asked for directions to the doctor's ranch. "So you're going up to Doc Livermore's, are you?" asked the postmaster, my informant. "Have you got an invitation?" I assured him that I had. "It's a good thing," he replied, "because he don't allow anyone on his place without one." There's something mighty funny going on up there. I'd like to go up there myself and see what's going on, but I don't want to get shot at like old Pete Johnson did when he tried to drop in on the dock and pay him a little call. Naturally, I tried to find out what was going on, but evidently the postmaster, who was also the express agent, didn't know. All he could tell me was that a lot of junk had come for the doctor by express, and that a lot more had been hauled in by truck from Reading. What kind of junk? I asked him. Almost everything, bub. Sheet steel, machinery, batteries, cases of glass, Lord knows what all. It's been going on ever since he landed there. He has a bunch of Indians working for him, and he don't let a white man on the place. Forced to be satisfied with this meager information, I started old Lizzie and lit out for the ranch. After I had turned off the main trail, I met no one until the ranch house was in sight. As I rounded a bend in the road which brought me inside of the building, I was forced to put on my brakes at top speed to avoid running into a chain which was stretched across the road. An Indian armed with a Winchester rifle stood behind it, and when I stopped, he came up and asked me my business. "My business is with Dr. Livermore," I said tartly. "You got letter?" he inquired. "No," I answered. "No catch 'em letter, no catch 'em doctor," he replied, and walked stolidly back to his post. "This is absurd!" I shouted, and drove Lizzie up to the chain. I saw that it was merely hooked to a ring at the end, and I climbed out and started to take it down. A .30-30 bullet embedded itself in the post an inch or two from my head, and I changed my mind about taking down that chain. "No catch 'em letter, no catch 'em doctor," said the Indian laconically as he pumped another shell into his gun. I was balked, until I noticed a pair of telephone wires running from the house to the tree to which one end of the chain was fastened. "Is that a telephone to the house?" I demanded. The Indian grunted an assent. "Dr. Livermore telephoned me to come and see him," I said. "Can't I call him up and see if he still wants to see me?" The Indian debated the question with himself for a minute, and then nodded a doubtful assent. I cranked the old coffee mill type of telephone which I found, and presently heard the voice of Dr. Livermore. "This is Tom Faber, Doctor," I said. "The Graphic sent me up to get a story from you, but there's an Indian here who started to murder me when I tried to get past your barricade." "Good for him," chuckled the doctor. "I heard the shot, but didn't know that he was shooting at you. Tell him to talk to me." The Indian took the telephone at my bidding and listened for a minute. "You go in," he agreed when he hung up the receiver. He took down the chain, and I drove on up to the house to find the doctor waiting for me on the veranda. "Hello, Tom," he greeted me heartily. "So you had trouble with my guard, did you?" "I nearly got murdered," I said ruefully. "I expect that Joe would have drilled you if you had tried to force your way in," he remarked cheerfully. "I forgot to tell him that you were coming today. I told him you would be here yesterday, but yesterday isn't today to that Indian. I wasn't sure you would get here at all, in point of fact, for I didn't know whether that old fool I talked to in your office would send you or someone else. If anyone else had been sent, he would have never got by Joe, I can tell you. Come in. Where's your bag?" "I haven't one," I replied. "I went to Calvada yesterday to see you, and didn't know until I got there that you were up here." The doctor chuckled. "I guess I forgot to tell where I was," he said. "That man I talked to got me so mad that I hung up on him before I told him. It doesn't matter, though. I can dig you up a new toothbrush, and you can make out with that. Come in." I followed him into the house, and he showed me a room fitted with a crude bunk, a washstand, a bowl, and a pitcher. "You won't have many luxuries here, Tom," he said, "but you won't need to stay here for more than a few days. My work is done. I am ready to start. In fact, I would have started yesterday instead of today had you arrived. Now don't ask any questions. It's nearly lunchtime." "What's the story, Doctor?" I asked after lunch as I puffed one of his excellent cigars. "And why did you pick me to tell it to?" "For several reasons," he replied, ignoring my first question. "In the first place, I like you, and I think that you can keep your mouth shut until you're told to open it. In the second place, I have always found that you had the gift of vision or imagination and have the ability to believe. In the third place, you are the only man I know who had the literary ability to write up a good story and at the same time has the scientific background to grasp what it is all about. Understand that unless I have your promise not to write this story until I tell you that you can, not a word will I tell you." I reflected for a moment. The Graphic would expect the story when I got back, but on the other hand, I knew that unless I gave the desired promise, the doctor wouldn't talk. "All right," I assented. "I'll promise." "Good," he replied. "In that case, I'll tell you all about it. No doubt you, like the rest of the world, think that I'm crazy." "Not at all," I stammered. In point of fact, I had often harbored such a suspicion. "Oh, that's all right," he went on cheerfully. "I am crazy. Crazy as a loon, which, by the way, is a highly sensible bird with a well-balanced mentality. There is no doubt that I am crazy, but my craziness is not of the usual type. Mine is the insanity of genius." He looked at me sharply as he spoke, but long sessions at poker and the San Francisco Press Club had taught me how to control my facial muscles, and I never batted an eye. He seemed satisfied and went on. "From your college work, you are familiar with the laws of magnetism," he said. "Perhaps, considering just what your college career really was, I might better say that you are supposed to be familiar with them." I joined with him in his laughter. "It won't require a very deep knowledge to follow the thread of my argument," he went on. "You know, of course, that the force of magnetic attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distances separating the magnet and the attracted particles, and also that each magnetized particle had two poles, a positive and a negative pole, or a north pole and a south pole, as they are usually called." I nodded. "Consider for a moment that the laws of magnetism, insofar as concerns the relation between distance and power of attraction, are exactly matched by the laws of gravitation." "But there the similarity between the two forces ends," I interrupted. "But there the similarity does not end," he said sharply. "That is the crux of the discovery which I have made, that magnetism and gravity are one and the same, or rather that the two are separate but similar manifestations of one force. The parallel between the two grows closer with each succeeding experiment. You know, for example, that each magnetized particle has two poles. Similarly, each gravitized particle, to coin a new word, had two poles, one positive and one negative. Every particle on the Earth is so oriented that the negative poles point toward the positive center of the Earth. This is what causes the commonly known phenomena of gravity or weight." "I can prove the fallacy of that in a moment," I retorted. "There are none so blind as those who will not see," he quoted with an icy smile. "I can probably predict your puerile argument, but go ahead and present it." "If two magnets are placed so that the north pole of one is in juxtaposition to the south pole of the other, they attract one another," I said. "If the position of the magnets be reversed so that the two similar poles are opposite, they will repel. If your theory was correct, a man standing on his head would fall off the earth." "Exactly what I expected," he replied. "Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen a small bar magnet placed within the field of attraction of a large electromagnet? Of course you have, and you have noticed that when the north pole of the bar magnet was pointed toward the electromagnet, the bar was attracted. However, when the bar was reversed and the south pole pointed toward the electromagnet, the bar was still attracted. You doubtless remember that experiment." "But in that case, the magnetism of the electromagnet was so large that the polarity of the small magnet was reversed," I cried. "Exactly. And the field of gravity of the Earth is so great compared to the gravity of a man, that when he stands on his head, his polarity is instantly reversed." I nodded. His explanation was too logical for me to pick a flaw in it. "If that same bar magnet were held in the field of the electromagnet with its north pole pointed toward the magnet, and then, by the action of some outside force of sufficient power, its polarity were reversed, the bar would be repelled. If the magnetism were neutralized and held exactly neutral, it would be neither repelled nor attracted, but would act only as the force of gravity impelled it. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," I assented. "That, then, paves the way for what I have to tell you. I have developed an electrical method of neutralizing the gravity of a body while it is within the field of the Earth, and also, by a slight extension, a method of entirely reversing its polarity." I nodded calmly. "Do you realize what this means?" he cried. "No," I replied, puzzled by his great excitement. "Man alive!" he cried. "It means that the problem of aerial flight is entirely revolutionized, and that the era of interplanetary travel is at hand. Suppose that I construct an airship and then render it neutral to gravity. It would weigh nothing, absolutely nothing. The tiniest propeller would drive it at an almost incalculable speed with a minimum consumption of power, for the only resistance to its motion would be the resistance of the air. If I were to reverse the polarity, it would be repelled from the Earth with the same force with which it is now attracted, and it would rise with the same acceleration as a body falls toward the Earth. It would travel to the moon in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Air resistance would... There is no air a few miles from the Earth. Of course, I do not mean that such a craft would take off from the Earth and land on the moon 3 hours later. There are 2 things which would interfere with that. One is the fact that the propelling force, the gravity of the Earth, would diminish as the square of the distance from the center of the Earth, and the other is that when the band of neutral attraction, or rather repulsion, between the Earth and the moon had been reached, it would be necessary to decelerate so as to avoid a smash-on landing. I have been over the whole thing, and I find that it would take 29 hours and 52 minutes to make the whole trip. The entire thing is perfectly possible. In fact, I have asked you here to witness and report the first interplanetary trip to be made." "Have you constructed such a device?" I cried. "My spaceship is finished and ready for your inspection," he replied. "If you will come with me, I will show it to you." Hardly knowing what to believe, I followed him from the house into a huge barn-like structure over 100 feet high which stood nearby. He opened the door and switched on a light, and there before me stood what looked at first glance to be a huge artillery shell, but of a size larger than any ever made. It was constructed of sheet steel, and while the lower part was solid, the upper sections had huge glass windows set in them. On the point was a mushroom-shaped protuberance. It measured perhaps 50 feet in diameter and was 140 feet high, the doctor informed me. A ladder led from the floor to a door about 50 feet from the ground. I followed the doctor up the ladder and into the space flyer. The door led us into a comfortable living room through a double-door arrangement. "The whole hall beneath us," explained the doctor, "is filled with batteries and machinery except for a space in the center, where a shaft leads to a glass window in the bottom so that I can see behind me, so to speak. The space above is filled with storerooms and the air-purifying apparatus. On this level is my bedroom, kitchen, and other living rooms, together with a laboratory and an observatory. There is a central control room located on an upper level, but it needs seldom be entered, for the craft can be controlled by a system of relays from this room, or from any other room in the ship. I suppose that you are more or less familiar with imaginative stories of interplanetary travel." I nodded in assent. "In that case, there's no use going over the details of the air purifying and such matters," he said. "The story writers have worked out all that sort of thing in great detail, and there is nothing novel in my arrangements. I carry food and water for 6 months and air enough for 2 months by constant renovating. Have you any question you wish to ask?" One objection I have seen frequently raised to the idea of interplanetary travel is that the human body could not stand the rapid acceleration which would be necessary to attain speed enough to ever get anywhere. How do you overcome this? "My dear boy, who knows what the human body can stand? When the locomotive was first invented, learned scientists predicted that the limit of speed was 30 miles an hour, as the human body could not stand a higher speed. Today, the human body stands a speed of 360 miles an hour without ill effects. At any rate, on my first trip, I intend to take no chances. We know that the body can stand an acceleration of 32 feet per second without trouble. That is the rate of acceleration due to gravity, and is the rate at which a body increases speed when it falls. This is the acceleration which I will use. Remember that the space traveled by a falling body in a vacuum is equal to 1/2 the acceleration multiplied by the square of the elapsed time. The moon, to which I intend to make my first trip, is only 280,000 miles, or 1,478,400,000 feet from us. With an acceleration of 32 feet per second, I would pass the moon 2 hours and 40 minutes after leaving the Earth. If I later take another trip, say to Mars, I will have to find a means of increasing my acceleration, possibly by the use of the rocket principle. Then will be time enough to worry about what my body will stand." A short calculation verified the figures the doctor had given me, and I stood convinced. "Are you really going?" I asked. "Most decidedly. To repeat, I would have started yesterday had you arrived. As it is, I am ready to start at once. We will go back to the house for a few minutes while I show you the location of an excellent telescope through which you may watch my progress, and instruct you in the use of an ultra-short-wave receiver which I am confident will pierce the heaviest layer. With this, I will keep in communication with you, although I have made no arrangements for you to send messages to me on this trip. I intend to go to the moon and land. I will take atmosphere samples through an airport, and, if there is an atmosphere which will support life, I will step out on the surface. If there is not, I will return to the Earth." A few minutes was enough for me to grasp the simple manipulations which I would have to perform, and I followed him again to the space flyer. "How are you going to get it out?" I asked. "Watch," he said. He worked some levers and the roof of the barn folded back, leaving the way clear for the departure of the huge projectile. I followed him inside and he climbed the ladder. "When I shut the door, go back to the house and test the radio," he directed. The door clanged shut and I hastened into the house. His voice came plainly enough. I went back to the flyer and waved him a final farewell, which he acknowledged through a window. Then I returned to the receiver. A loud hum filled the air, and suddenly the projectile rose and flew out through the open roof, gaining speed rapidly until it was a mere speck in the sky. It vanished. I had no trouble in picking him up with the telescope. In fact, I could see the doctor through one of the windows. "I have passed beyond the range of the atmosphere, Tom," came his voice over the receiver, "and I find that everything is going exactly as it should. I feel no discomfort, and my only regret is that I did not install a transmitter in the house so that you could talk to me. But there is no real necessity for it. I am going to make some observations now, but I will call you again with a report of progress in half an hour." For the rest of the afternoon and all of that night, I received his messages regularly, but with the coming of daylight they began to fade. By 9 o'clock I could get only a word here and there. By noon I could hear nothing. I went to sleep hoping that the night would bring better reception, nor was I disappointed. About 8 o'clock I received a message, rather faintly, but nonetheless distinctly. "I regret more than ever that I did not install a transmitter so that I could learn from you whether you are receiving my messages," his voice said faintly. "I have no idea of whether you can hear me or not, but I will keep on repeating this message every hour while my battery holds out. It is now 30 hours since I left the Earth, and I should be on the moon according to my calculations. But I am not, and never will be. I am caught at the neutral point where the gravity of the Earth and the moon are exactly equal. I had relied on my momentum to carry me over this point. Once over it, I expected to reverse my polarity and fall on the moon. My momentum did not do so. If I keep my polarity as it was when left the Earth, both the Earth and the moon repel me. If I reverse it, they both attract me, and again I cannot move. If I had equipped my space flyer with a rocket so that I could move a few miles, or even a few feet from the deadline, I could proceed. But I did not do so, and I cannot move forward or back. Apparently I am doomed to stay here until my air gives out. Then my body, entombed in my spaceship, will endlessly circle the Earth as a satellite until the end of time. There is no hope for me, for long before a duplicate of my device equipped with rockets could be constructed and come to my rescue, my air would be exhausted. Goodbye, Tom. You may write your story as soon as you wish. I will repeat my message in 1 hour. Goodbye. At 9 and at 10 o'clock the message was repeated. At 11 it started again, but after a few sentences the sound suddenly ceased and the receiver went dead. I thought that the fault was with the receiver, and I toiled feverishly the rest of the night, but without result. I learned later that the messages heard all over the world ceased at the same hour. The next morning, Professor Montesquieu announced his discovery of the world's new satellite. End of Section 7, Into Space by Sterner St. Paul.
Did you enjoy that? I have to say I did, and I found it fascinating. Such a rich tale and read so very well by Stephen Bateman. I was not able to find out any information about the author, which is typical of these classic stories. You see, writing science fiction in the 30s at the time was not considered real literature, and most writers used pen names. Analog Science Fiction magazine has been published under various names since 1930. Originally, it was called Astounding Stories of Super Science, with its first issue in January of 1930. It went bankrupt in 1933, and the magazine was sold to Street and Smith. Under new management, Astounding became the leading pulp mag of its time. Over the next few years, it published many stories that became classics in the field, including Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. This period of time is often referred to as the golden age of science fiction. The magazine, well, it continues on today as a bi-monthly publication. It can be purchased as both an ebook and printed magazine. How about that?
Ron, that was episode number 436.
Yes, it was. And I have to thank Ann Hansen, Jack Browning, Tisa Barlow, Alexander Short, and Stephen Bateman for taking part in the show this week. Really good stuff. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find a link for every need. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Pressing that follow button helps us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's amazing stories.